So first of all, I would like to say thank you very much, Aswani sir, for inviting me here. So now let's talk about today's session. So my today's session is purely based on the hands-on. But before to start the hands-on session, 20 to 30 minutes, I would like to discuss about what is the basic concept of cybersecurity, right? Why we are using cybersecurity? What is the main concept of cybersecurity, right? So everything will be covered within 20 to 30 minutes, and later on we will directly move towards the hands-on session, right? So the today's agenda would be information gathering, which is the first steps of vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, which is the first steps of vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And after that, I will be discussing about the social engineering, right? So whenever the cyber security comes into the picture, the one term everyone is heard, right? That is vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. So before to kickstart the journey in the field of cyber security, it is very much essential to understand what is vulnerability assessment and what is penetration testing. And before to kickstart journey in the field of cyber security, we need to understand two terms: vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, and the second one is the cyber forensic, right? So these two terms are very much important. So vulnerability assessment and penetration testing is purely a concept of cyber security. Means whenever any cyber crime occurs, whenever any vulnerability has been found, whenever it has been reported, it will be considered under the VAPT, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And the second term which I have talked about, it is called as a cyber forensic. So cyber forensic is the post-crime scenario. Means once the crime is committed, then how to investigate. It is a, you can say, the main task of the law enforcement officer. Once the crime gets committed, they just reach to the incident when this thing is happened, they just collect the evidence, and finally they are try to call the specific, you can say, the attacker, or you can say the criminal, right? So these two terms are very much, you can say, the important to understand before to start the concept of cyber security. So first thing is the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, and second one is the cyber forensic. So I will be talking in my session is about vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And in case of VAPT, the first step is whenever you want to start the concept of vulnerability assessment, our first task is we need to knowledge about a specific domain on which we want to perform such kind of thing. So it is called as a information gathering. So this is what the brief idea about VAPT. We'll see in detail what is VA, what is PT, so you will get the exact idea. So this would be the outline of my presentation. First of all, we'll discuss what is VA, what is PT, then OWASP. OWASP is those who have worked in the field of cyber security, they might be aware about what is OWASP. OWASP is the Open Web Security Application Project, right? It is funded by the US government, and every 2 to 3 years they are announcing the top 10 vulnerabilities, right? So we'll be discussing about what are the latest top 10 vulnerabilities, and finally we'll move towards the hands-on session. So the first thing is the vulnerability assessment, right? So before to start the vulnerability assessment, first of all we should have an idea about what is vulnerability. So anyone have any idea? Just forget about the computer system. What do you mean by vulnerability? In simple language, suppose I want to define a vulnerability. What does it mean? Any mistake, any bug, any error, right? So suppose I want to define this vulnerability in terms of my computer system, so I can define in two different ways, right? The first thing is any bug or error which I have made while coding the software, yes or no, right? And the second thing is if I forget to follow a standard procedure to design my software, right? So it can be a procedural error, that is the second thing, and first thing is a coding error. If I made mistake, if I do a wrong coding, then it might be possible that my software and my code or my website, my API or mobile application does not work properly, right? So broadly we can categorize vulnerability in two different ways, right? And after that, vulnerability assessment means what? Whatever vulnerability is available in my system, with the help of different tools, if I am able to collect that vulnerability, if I am assessing that vulnerability, if I am able to find out what is the impact of that vulnerability on my system, it is called as a vulnerability assessment. Is it clear? Up to this it is clear to everyone? What is vulnerability and what is vulnerability assessment? In computer system, we can define vulnerability is two different ways, right? The very first one is either you can say bug or error which you have made in your software making process, right? And the second one is if you have forgot to follow a standard procedure while developing your software. It is called as a SOP, Standard Operational Procedure. So this way we can define the vulnerability. And vulnerability assessment means you need to check what kind of vulnerability is present on a specific target, and after that you need to find out what would be the impact of that vulnerability on your system. Means by exploiting that vulnerability, what kind of thing can be happen with your system. It is called as a vulnerability assessment, right? So these are the process. Suppose I want to perform simply vulnerability assessment, then there will be a 4 steps are there. The very first one is the asset discovery. Means there are, first of all, I need to define my target. First of all, I need to define my scope, right? There are various kind of target will be available. If I am talking about the scope of my system, then it would be a website, it could be a mobile application, it could be a specific network. So first of all, I need to define on which device or on which target I want to perform vulnerability assessment, right? So that is the first step. So it could be, as I have mentioned, it could be a website of your university, that is vit.ac.in. Suppose I want to find out a vulnerability, whether it is present or not in the domain of my university, then first of all I need to define a specific target. A scope should be defined first. So let's say I have defined vit.ac.in will be my scope, right? I want to find a vulnerability present in the website of vit.ac.in is available or not, right? So that is the first step. Second one is the vulnerability scanning. Means once you have select your target, once you have define your scope, then your next task is, with the help of automated tool, with the help of open source tool, with the help of license version tool, with the help of manual method, there are different kinds of ways that we will discuss in our hands-on session. You need to find whether such kind of vulnerability is present in this domain or not, right? Is it clear? These 2 steps are clear? Say yes or no, so at least I can come to know whether you are getting this point or not. Yes or no? Okay. Now third point is the vulnerability assessment. So once, let's say, sake of example, vit.ac.in I have selected as a target, right? And can I get the marker? Can I get the marker? Okay. So let's say I have defined my domain as a vit.ac.in, right? This is my domain. Now next task is vulnerability scanning. So there are various methods, as I have mentioned. There are some open source tool, there are some license version tool, there are some manual method which I applied on this specific domain. And after that, let's say I have find out the list of vulnerability A, B and C. So this will be my step number 2. And in step number 3, the vulnerability assessment. That means what is the impact? Means if this vulnerability is someone is trying to exploit this vulnerability, then what would be the impact of this vulnerability? Let's say I am giving one name, SQL injection. This is the name of one vulnerability. What is SQL injection? That we will see later on. But right now consider that SQL injection is a name of vulnerability, right? And with the help of this procedure, if I am able to find this SQL injection in my domain vit.ac.in, then impact of SQL injection would be what? If this SQL injection vulnerability is present in my domain, then anyone can steal the admin username and password. So that will be determined in case of step number 3. So these 3 steps are clear? Yes or no? And the last thing is the mitigation technique. So once I able to know this kind of vulnerability is available in my system, so what would be the mitigation technique? How I can patch this vulnerability? So that will be considered into the step number 4. So these are the 4 steps are associated in case of vulnerability assessment. Currently we have not touched penetration testing. Currently we are only talking about the vulnerability assessment. So these 4 steps are clear. The first one is you need to define your scope. Second thing is with the help of different kind of tools, you need to scan that domain so you can come to know this kind of vulnerabilities are present. After that, your next step would be vulnerability assessment. Means what is the impact of the vulnerability which you have found out. In this case, we have found the SQL injection. So the impact of SQL injection is what? It might be possible if your website or if your domain is vulnerable to SQL injection, then anyone can get the username and password of the admin profile. So this would be the impact of this specific vulnerability. And later on in this step number 4, my task would be to find the mitigation technique. Means how I can patch this vulnerability so my domain will be prevented against such kind of attack. Is it clear? So these are the process of vulnerability assessment. Now let's OAuth comes into the picture. So far we have discussed about the vulnerability. But the name of vulnerabilities are this one. There are lot many vulnerabilities are there, but currently we are talking about the top 10 vulnerabilities, right? So it will be identified by the OWASP. So OWASP is nothing but the Open Web Application Security Project. It is funded by the US government. So whenever any new vulnerability or any continuous vulnerability has been identified, so that will be reported to the some agencies, and that database goes to the OWASP. And based on the reported vulnerability, OWASP will decide that these are the top 10 vulnerability within this span of time. So in 2017, you can see that these are the list of vulnerabilities starting from 1 to position number 10. But in 2021, so every 3 to 4 years of time span, this list of top 10 vulnerability gets changed, right? So it is depend upon how the number of vulnerabilities gets reported, right? So we can say that in 2021, the maximum number of vulnerability has been reported as a broken access control. So what is broken access control? That we will see, right? But these are the name of the vulnerabilities, top 10 vulnerabilities, that is in 2021. Broken access control, cryptographic failure. I will give you the basic idea what each and every vulnerability says, so you will come to know what exactly things behind such kind of vulnerability. But this is clear what is OAuth and OAuth top 10, right? So this is the basic idea about each and every vulnerability, what each vulnerability says. So broken access control means when any unauthenticated or unauthorized users or visitor try to access the profile, or you can say the block of authenticated user, and it will try to comment or it will try to change the comment of that specific visitor. So it will be considered as a broken access control, right? If I am talking about the cryptographic failure, then whenever any person is able to steal the sensitive information of any user. So what does this sensitive information means? It can be a cookie, it can be a session ID. Anyone have any idea what is cookie and what is session ID, right? So whenever, let's say, those who are not aware about these cookies and session ID, so let's say this is the client, this is the server, this is the server of Facebook. Let's say client is using, let's say, Chrome. So this client, let's say, want to open facebook.com. So he just open the Google Chrome. He just writing www.facebook.com. The request will send to the server of the Facebook. Then the Facebook will check whether this user is authenticated or not, right? If the user gets authenticated by the Facebook server, the client will able to see its Facebook homepage. And along with the response, the Facebook also provides some kind of information for this particular session, right? So that information we can say it's a cookie. So for a specific session, some information will be stored at the client's machine. And in which machine this information gets stored? In the browser. So whenever this entire session is on, at the client side, it will retrieve the information from the browser and this specific session gets activated. So if someone try to steal this information which has been sent by the Facebook, so that person is also able to log in into the Facebook account with the name of this client. Are you follow me what I am trying to say, right? So this kind of information will be considered as a cookie and the session ID, right? So cryptographic failure means if someone try to steal such kind of information from the client machine, whether it is cookie, whether it is session ID or any other thing, then he or she can be able to pertain himself as a genuine client, right? So this kind of vulnerability will be considered as a cryptographic failure. The third one is the injection. So there are various kind of injections are there. SQL injection is there, HTML injection is there, OS injection is there. So we have just spoken about the SQL injection. So everyone is aware about the structure query language, right? So how it will work? It is generally nothing but the one kind of language which is communicate with the database server, right? So whenever we want to retrieve some data from the database, so directly we cannot retrieve that data. We need to talk in terms of database. So the language which database can understand, it is all about the SQL, structure query language. So how the SQL will perform? Let's say this is my database, this is my SQL query. So with the help of SQL query, I am requesting to the database, I want this kind of information. Let's say my query is very simple, select star from name of the database, that is ABC and semicolon. So what does this query means? I want to retrieve the information of table ABC from the database. So whenever this query will be executed by the database server, it will retrieve the information of all the data which follows under the ABC table. Yes or no? But what does SQL injection means? This is my legitimate query, right? Which database can understand. But if I do some modification in this query, so this database does not understand that modification. Yes or no? So whatever interpretation that database have, according to that, it will give the response. So let's say if I am simply add double inverted comma after the completion of this query, so this is nothing but the malicious query. So this query does not actually understand by the database. So whatever interpretation it has come with the help of this specific malicious query, it will give the response. The response could be anything. It will not be details of table ABC, but it could be anything. It could be a list of other tables rather than ABC. So what I am trying to say that by injecting any malicious code in your genuine query, the database will give the different response, and that response helps you to exploit the actual database. So this is called as a SQL injection. Is this clear? Yes or no? So similarly, we are having HTML injection. Similarly, we are having OS injection. So these are the categories comes under the injection. So this is the vulnerability number 3. The fourth one is the insecure design, right? So if you have not properly designed your login page, then it might be possible that your login page is vulnerable to the brute force attack. So those who have studied the cryptography, so they might be aware about what is brute force attack, right? So it's a simply guessing technique, yes or no? The attacker prepare one list which having the combination of username and password, and one by one it will just try to fire on the login page. If the appropriate match will be found, then he is able to successfully log in into the system, right? So if this kind of page is not securely designed, then it might be vulnerable against the brute force attack. So practically we will see how we can perform the brute force attack. That I will tell you, right, in the hands-on session. But it can be happen with the help of insecure design. So if you currently if you are seeing the login page, right, so you will find the two main things. The first thing is the captcha comes into the picture, and second one is they are checking whether you are robot or whether you are human. Yes or no? So these two things are the important while designing your login page. So continuously if you are firing requests now, so that specific server will understand this has been done by the automated tools. This has been not done by the human. So that's why they are verifying whether you are human or whether you are robot. Yes or no? So whenever you are making such kind of login page, so that's why currently in recent login pages, whenever you are taking any standard website, they are come up with the captcha as well as they are checking whether you are human or whether you are robot, right? So that will be considered as an insecure design. The fifth one is the security misconfiguration, right? So whenever your server is not properly configured, right, then it might be possible that your server is vulnerable against the DDoS attack. DDoS attack means distributed denial of service. So what does DDoS attack means? So let me tell you. So with the help of this example, you can come to know what is DDoS attack. This is my server, right? This is the regular user and this is the attackers. So if let's say this is the server of Facebook. This is the genuine user. So what will happen? Every server has a capability to give the response. Means a server can handle some amount of requests within some amount of time period. Let's say it is purely depend upon the configuration of server. Let's say if I'm talking about the capacity of XYZ server, let's say Facebook server. So the capacity of this server is within 20 seconds, he can handle around 1 lakh requests, right? So the capacity of this server is within 20 seconds, he can entertain only 1 lakh requests. But consider that within 20 seconds, if I am able to send 2 lakh or 20 lakh requests to the Facebook server, then what will happen? It goes down. So this is nothing but the distributed denial of service attack. When a number of requests goes beyond the excess of the server capacity, at that time your server gets down, and it is considered as a distributed denial of service. Here you can see that the attacker is continuously sending a request to this server, and the capacity of this server gets over, and now it goes down. So again, if you can configure your server in such a way that your server has a capability to check whether this request is genuine or whether this request is malicious. If your server is able to justify or identify whether this request is malicious, so he can easily stop giving response to such kind of malicious traffic. Yes or no? So he can only handle the genuine request. So this can be considered under the server misconfiguration. So if your server is not properly configured, then it might be possible that your server is, you can say, they can be attacked with the help of DDoS attack. And the second one is the man in the middle attack. So man in the middle attack means what? That also you can easily understand with the help of this diagram. When the user send a request to the server, attacker in between try to steal the information, right? So again, if you are not using the SSL connection, everyone is aware about the secure socket layer, HTTP and HTTPS, right? So in HTTP, your data is transferred in a plain text. But if I am talking about HTTPS, your data will be transferred in, right? So there are some tools, right, which can sniff the traffic in between the communication. The Wireshark is a very well-known tool, right? With the help of Wireshark, you can sniff the traffic. So if your data is not secure with the HTTPS protocol, or you can say the SSL certification, then it might be possible that the attacker can get the data in a plain text. So that information could be anything. That can be a username or password, right? So anything he can steal. So this kind of thing is considered under the, you can say, the security misconfiguration. After that, the sixth vulnerability is vulnerable and outdated component. So in few years back, you have heard about the WannaCry ransomware. If you have heard about this WannaCry ransomware. So this ransomware is attack on the Windows XP system. So you can imagine that currently now Windows 10 comes into the picture, and there are some banks and some organizations still using Windows XP system. Even though the Microsoft have said that now onwards we will not give any kind of support to such kind of operating system. So there are lot many vulnerabilities are there in case of Windows XP, though the people are using Windows XP system. So the vulnerability is openly available in the market, so anyone can use that vulnerability to exploit the Windows XP system. So that's why it is always recommend that keep update your system, keep continuously patch your system. So why the regularly update comes to your system? If you are using the genuine license version software, so every 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, the updates comes from the Microsoft. If you are using the license version of Windows 10 or 11, right? So every 10 days, every 1 or 2 days, the updates comes from the Microsoft. So that update is nothing but it's a patch. So whenever any vulnerability they come to know with the existing system, so that can be patched within that specific update. So that's why we are always recommend that keep update your system, whether it is phone, whether it is your phone or whether it is your specific software, right? And always go for the licensed version software, right? Don't rely on a third party, or you can say any free version software, which actually comes under the licensed version category, right? Then seventh vulnerability is identification and data integrity failure, right? So whenever you are using any weak password, right, and the recovery option is also not good, then it might be possible for the attacker to simply guess. Generally, if you are talking about the network router, in most of the university, in most of the system, the default username and password are admin. So if anyone come to know about the IP address of that router, he can easily guess the username and password. He can simply enter inside the router and he can do anything. So that's why it is always recommend use the strong username and password to protect your system, right? Then software and data integrity failure. So this can be possible if you are using any third-party code or third-party tool, right? So we know the GitHub repository, right? Everything is available in GitHub. Whenever you want to do anything, the entire code is available in the GitHub. So don't rely everything on the GitHub, because someone has don't that much sharp that we know, right? Some kind of mistake he may be made inside its coding, right? And that, you can say, such kind of mistake is very much harmful to our system whenever we are using such kind of software which has been designed by some other person, right? Then security logging and monitoring failure. So it is always recommend that whenever you are using any system, so continuously monitor your log, right? So why this log monitoring is important? So with the help of log monitoring, you can come to know whether someone is trying to attack your system or not, if any malicious thing is going within your network or not. See, sometimes what happen, the attacker is not from the outside, it's from your intruder also, inside only, right? If I'm talking about any IT industry, so in most of the cyber attack, the information goes from the inside only, right? So that can be identified with the help of log monitoring system, right? So it is always recommend that you need to continuously monitor your system to prevent against such kind of vulnerability, which is called as a security logging and monitoring failure. And the last one is the server side request forgery, right? So whenever the server is not differentiate whether this is the genuine client and this is the malicious client, then this kind of vulnerability comes into the picture. So this is what the OWASP top 10, right? So these are the top 10 vulnerability which has been listed in 2021. There are lot many vulnerabilities are available. I will show you the database, how this vulnerability has been stored, how the specific number has been given to that vulnerability. So everyone can come to know about that particular vulnerability, and if such kind of vulnerability they can found in that system, so they can be easily patched, right? But these are the top 10 vulnerabilities. So we are looking for this vulnerability, and to find out this vulnerability, our first step is we need to scan the system, and to scan the system, our first step is information gathering, right? So in today's session, for the hands-on session, we are using information gathering to find this kind of vulnerabilities, right, with the help of open source tool and some inbuilt tools, right? Now let's talk about the penetration testing. So far we have discussed about the vulnerability assessment. Now what does penetration testing means? So vulnerability assessment does not claim any practical oriented thing. Means, let's say we have seen 4 different steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. This is the asset discovery, this is vulnerability scanning, this is vulnerability assessment, and this is remediation, right? So in case of vulnerability assessment, we are not practically check whether this ABC vulnerability, what is the impact of this ABC vulnerability. Whatever theoretical concept we are having, we are only decide the impact of that vulnerability based on the theoretical concept. Means what I am trying to say that in step number 2, with the help of vulnerability scanning, we have find A, B and C vulnerability, right? These are the vulnerability I am able to find in this step number 2. So in step number 3, whatever standard theoretical concept I am having, let's say I have found SQL injection in step number 2. So the theory concept of SQL injection says what? If your system is vulnerable to SQL injection, it might be possible that the username and password of the admin account can be breached, can be stolen by the attacker, right? But in case of penetration testing, practically we are performing SQL injection attack on the domain, and we are trying to check whether we are able to get the username and password of the admin account or not. So this is called as a penetration testing. Actually, you are exploit the domain, you can get the access privilege of the attacker machine, of the target machine, you can exploit that system, and you can see what kind of thing you can do with this system. So this is called as a penetration testing. So there are 2 things are interconnected, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. If you can see this diagram, so you can get the exact idea what is vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. These 4 steps are considered as a VA, and these 4 steps are considered as a PT. So we'll start with the scope. First of all, we define the scope. Then first of all, we need to scan the target. So for that, information gathering is very much required. Then with the help of information gathering, we are able to identify these are the vulnerabilities are present. Then we can create the impact, means what would be the impact of this vulnerability. And here we are actually exploit that vulnerability and will get the privilege escalation. We are trying to insert the victim machine and we will check whether this vulnerability is exploitable or not. And once we are able to exploit that system, then we will analyze, means what kind of different things we can do with that specific vulnerability. After that, we will report that this kind of vulnerability is present, we exploited this kind of vulnerability, and this vulnerability can damage your system in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways. And after that, we also give the recommendation, if you want to remove this kind of vulnerability, then these are the steps that you need to follow, right? So this is the entire cycle of the vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. So in today's session, we will be focusing on vulnerability assessment, and in case of vulnerability assessment, we will be focusing on information gathering. So this is clear, the idea of today's talk is clear. Up to this clear? Any doubt, any query? Because see, this is the foundation. If you are not aware about what is vulnerability assessment, what is penetration testing, I cannot start with directly with the information gathering, right? So this is very much crucial for you to get the basic idea about, see, I have not explained everything in very much detail, but give you an overview. What kind of thing is available with the VA, what kind of thing is available with the PT. So whenever actually we are performing any hands-on thing, so at least you can aware about what kind of thing we are doing. Because generally people are using different kind of tools, but they are not aware about what they are looking for, right? There are lot many tools are available, but if you are not knowing what you are looking for, then it will be difficult for you to finally identify the vulnerability, right? So any doubt up to this? Any doubt? So I think everything is clear, right? So now let's start with the hands-on session.